I'm Corinne Schaefer, and welcome to Create Outside the Box. In this episode, I will be speaking with musician Danny Weiss about his musical journey, Americana music, and his role as a musical educator. If you're interested in watching our conversation, please visit the Creative Operations YouTube channel under the playlist Create Outside the Box. With over 60 years of musical experience, Danny Weiss is a sought-after singer, songwriter, and guitarist in the New York metro area. His musical journey spans various genres, from rock to bluegrass to folk and jug band music. In 1972, he moved to Syracuse, New York, and began contributing his talents to a number of Syracuse bands, including Country Granola, Cross Creek, and the Down City Ramblers. In 1978, he joined the Monroe Doctrine in Colorado, and in 1980, returned to his native New Jersey as a founding member of the pioneering newgrass band, Tony Trischka and Skyline. They toured globally and recorded 4 albums. Danny, alongside partner Mary Olive Smith, now leads New York bands Wreck So and Stillhouse Serenade, covering a mix of genres including originals, honky-tonk, roots, country, blues, and Americana. He also fronts the acoustic trio Silk City that features his Skyline bandmates Barry Mitterhoff and Larry Cohen. His impressive career includes performances at Carnegie Hall and the Kennedy Center. He has appeared with Vassar Clements, Tex Logan, and David Bromberg, and his many recordings include the soundtrack of the Disney film The Rookie. His guitar talents have been recognized by Frets magazine, and he has been featured in guitar workshops and performances throughout the US, Canada, Japan, Europe, and Russia. In his spare time, Danny has moonlighted as a librarian for the past 30 years, currently serving as the director of the Fanwood Memorial Public Library in New Jersey. So hello, Danny, and welcome to Create Outside the Box. Thank you so much for being here with me this morning.
Hi, Corinne. It's a pleasure to be here, and I was very excited when you reached out about this project, and looking forward to digging into it a little bit.
Of course. And I want to start with you, because before we delve into Americana music, because you are one of our speakers for our concert series, I thought it would be interesting to delve into your own musical journey. And I want to start at the beginning, which is, what was your first introduction to music? I know you're a singer, a songwriter, you play the guitar. So what was your first introduction and what drew you to those art forms?
My mom encouraged me to take music lessons when I was a kid. Neither of my parents were musicians. Full disclosure, I was born in 1952. I know that seems almost impossible to some people, but so, you know, my parents were raised, they were they were kids of the Depression, and they were products of World War II, you know, and I was born in the early 50s and grew up in the 60s. So anyway, my parents liked to listen to music like, they were into folk music. They liked Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and the Weavers. They also liked things like, comedy, Hello Mutta, Hello Fada. And they also liked show tunes. That was their other thing. And I guess just my mom thought that a well-rounded human should, potentially play an instrument. So she brought me to the local music store in Millburn, New Jersey. I grew up in Springfield, New Jersey, neighboring town. And we looked at all the instruments, and she said to me, 7 years old, "So what do you think? What do you want to play?" And I wanted to play the trumpet. I don't necessarily think I really wanted to play anything, but there's the trumpet. So the guy, he handed me the trumpet, and of course it was impossible for a 7-year-old to get a sound out of it. And he said, maybe the guitar is a better choice for you. So he handed me the guitar, and that's what I did. And I took lessons for a couple of years and then wasn't too interested. But then when I was about 13, 12 or 13, I guess, I re-embraced the guitar. Now it's the early 60s, and you've got the Beatles, you've got the British Invasion, there's rock and roll. I was into all of that. And at the same time, I was into that same kind of stuff that my folks had listened to. I got to go see Dave Van Ronk when I was like 9 years old in a tent somewhere in Syracuse, New York. So they were into the music and seeing the live music. My mom was a dancer also, among other things, and danced with the Martha Graham. Well, was a student of Marjorie Mazie, who was Woody Guthrie's wife, who danced with the Martha Graham Dance Company. So I think my mom always felt like she had a little bit of a direct connection to Woody Guthrie kind of thing. So I started playing, rock and roll, but also some folk music. And both my mom and my grandmother were big singers. And so I had that going on at my house also. And then when I got to middle school, I met a guy who played the guitar and also the mandolin. And we became friendly. He started by playing, music that you like reading music and playing sort of classical, like violin music on the mandolin. But very quickly discovered bluegrass music. And like a guy named Bill Monroe, who's the acknowledged father of bluegrass music, who was a mandolin player. So my friend Barry and I started exploring bluegrass music, also folk music. We were big fans of jug band music, Jim Kweskin's jug band, and all of these. We were like maybe a half a generation behind some of these people, like Jim Kweskin, for example, who had a active jug band going in the mid-late 60s. And he was not ripping off, but he was, influenced by all of these early blues recordings. People like R. Crumb, who was drawing, Zap comics, that kind of thing. But he was also a big proponent of this like early 20s jazz, ragtime kind of stuff. So my friend and I got into all of that. In high school, we had jug bands, we had bluegrass bands, we had folk bands. The notion of a person writing their own songs, was something that seemed like you could do that, with those folk music influences, people writing, not like parodies. Woody Guthrie didn't write that many melodies, but he wrote lots and lots of lyrics. And then, of course, with like the Beatles, they were some of the first band that was like the whole world realized, well, before that, there were songwriters and then there were performers. And so all of a sudden you could do both. And of course, that was also economically smart because you didn't have to pay two people. That was how I spread out. And my interests in music were just widened. It was also a time when, exploration was big. So not only was I finding people like Doc Watson playing the guitar and, Norman Blake playing the guitar, Clarence White, but I'm also finding Jimi Hendrix. I'm also finding jazz guitar players, Barney Kessel and Tal Farlow and all these amazing, so there's like a whole, as you spread out, you see like what the guitar is capable of. And then starting to listen to other world musics as well. Here's what they're doing with guitars in Africa. Here's what they're doing with guitars in, here and there in South America and so on. That was my sort of entry into the world of playing music. I'm sure my mom was less than thrilled because she urged me to play the guitar. And then when I went ahead and did it and basically left home when I was 18 years old to go do that, she probably had second thoughts about the whole thing. I ended up, actually, I went to college for a year and a half, almost 2 years out of high school, and then dropped out of college in 1972 to go play music full time. Moved up to Syracuse, New York, played with bands there. Moved out to Denver, Colorado. I played with some bands out there. Moved back to the East Coast in about 1980, and I've been here ever since, and spent pretty much 1980 to 1990 with a band called Skyline, with included my friend Barry, mm-hmm. The mandolin player, as well as a pretty well-known banjo player named Tony Trischka, who I met in the early 70s when I moved up to Syracuse, which is his hometown. The first band that I was involved in Syracuse, New York, was also Tony Trischka was playing in that band.
Wow. Now, I want to kind of unpack some of this stuff, because what was interesting is you were talking about how when you really got into playing the guitar, and you were coming at it from like, okay, let's see what the guitar can do from all of the different, jazz, African, bluegrass, but you were also seeing what music can do, and kind of breaking down all of the expression that these different genres within music can bring to the table. And it's interesting because you have performed so many different styles of music, like you said, folk, jug band, country, bluegrass. Can you say what these individual genres like jazz have, how they've influenced you as a musician? Or is it just so much now from childhood to adulthood? Is it so much part of who you are that it's just become like a combined language of music when you play?
Probably yes to the latter, the last thing you said. I mean, I've been playing the guitar now for over 50 years, but no, still when I play sort of in a style, if I'm playing at a contra dance, I'm playing a certain way on the guitar. I'm not going to be playing jazzy chords. So when I'm playing in a certain kind of band, I'm going to stick with the conventions of the genre, I guess you'd say. And I'd say even a person, let's say like Doc Watson, who passed not so long ago and would have been 100 years old today, he was very influential on loads of guitar players, because he sort of demonstrated in sort of bluegrass country music that the guitar could be a lead instrument, and take solos like the fiddle, like the banjo, like the mandolin. People weren't really doing that so much. I mean, I could go on, but the way that Doc Watson played guitar, he also played in swing bands, and he played in sort of, I guess you'd call like sort of proto rock band, like in the late 40s and 50s and stuff. He played electric guitar as well. I think part of my general thesis here is as I've looked around at the topic that you asked me to speak about here, a lot of it has to do with technology and the ability of that technology to spread the music around into people's consciousness. Because it made me think about how, let's say, prior to 1900, let's say, if you wanted to hear music, you had fairly few options. And really the only options were to find a place where a person was playing music live, whether it was at the local dance or on the front porch or in a concert hall. You could go see opera, you could go see classical music, you could go to a barn dance, you could listen to your uncle and your cousins playing fiddle and banjo on the front porch, but that was it. You could hear bluegrass music when Bill Monroe drove through your town and set up a tent and had a show and that kind of thing. I think people were limited. The people that wanted to play music were limited in their experience to just what they heard. And so they played like the things that they heard, And then, I mean, without going through it all moment by moment, but, then the rise of records, when records became a thing. So the first recordings were like in the very early 1900s, late 1800s. And I think I found, by the 20s, I guess, the teens, the 20s, people had record players, gramophones, wind up, Mm-hmm. And so now you could hear You could live in rural Texas and hear opera music anytime you wanted to. You could live in, whatever. You could live down south and hear classical music, or you could live in Maine and hear Southern fiddling. That was impossible prior to that. And then also, I guess, like in the 20s and 30s, like radio started. Now all bets were off. Now, because even when there were records, you had to have a record player and you had to be able to afford to buy a record. Mm-hmm. And you could probably only afford to buy a handful of records. So those were the ones that you had to listen to over and over again. I think I saw a thing that by like 1940, over 80% of the country had radios.
Yeah.
So now you're listening to all kinds of stuff. I mean, now the cat's out of the bag everywhere. And so that's what it made me think about. And the recording of music, when you hear old recordings of country guys, when you hear what they like, this guy, Ralph Peer in 1929 in Bristol, Tennessee, recorded the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers on one day. And it's referred to as the Big Bang of country music. But when you hear when you hear Jimmy Rogers play and you realize he was sort of a rock star in his day, young girls swooned, people loved it. It was just, it's just, they couldn't believe how influential he was. But when we hear it now, we're not really hearing it the way that he, we sort of hear how he sounded, but we're limited by the technology of the recording. So everything, all those old recordings that sound kind of nasally and tinny, and that's not really what Bessie Smith sounded like, or Hank Williams, or Louis Armstrong. We've never heard. I mean, many people have never heard those performers live, and never will. And the only recordings we have are, kind of limited by the quality of the recording technology. And it also helps spread the genres out. So now guys who lived in rural Texas who were playing, dance music, all of a sudden they heard big band music and they're like, whoa, we could do that, only we could do it with fiddles and lap steel guitars. And all of a sudden you have Western swing music, which is a combination of like American fiddle music and dance music and big band jazz. And you hear how the musicians in Texas have now learned how to play jazz and have, embraced the language of jazz on their instruments. So, and then of course, as we move forward, forget about it, the internet and streaming and all of that. So now you have a music like bluegrass music, let's say, which I've been involved in, which was sort of formalized like in the early 40s in America, has spread worldwide. It also made me think, generally speaking, about why some of that collision of all these musics is even possible when we live in a world where people tend to butt heads more than cooperate, it seems like,
Yeah.
But music it strikes me how music is, it's a language that doesn't require, or that, that surpasses boundaries. It's easy to sort of think about what the evolution of American music is. Most other countries have their own music, right? Like their own folk music, French folk songs, Italian dance music, and so. But in Italy in the 1800s, let's say, there were no other. They weren't being influenced by, Greek music as well, and they didn't hear people playing orchestral harp necessarily. So their influences were limited. But then they all came to America, and so there was that big mix of music in America pre-technology.
Yeah. Because we were a melting pot as a nation, and then that became a melting pot of music, which is what makes Americana so special because of those influences. And it's interesting when you talk about the technology, because you're absolutely right, is it allowed for that kind of combination of ideas, even just your own personal story of listening to all of these recordings and how it influenced you on just a very, you're listening to music. You don't even realize how the music's influencing you. You're just enjoying it, and it's informing your musical tastes and choices. And it isn't until we're exposed to something that we really know how to appreciate it or use it, which is why exposure of art and music and all of its genres are so important, because maybe you won't love a particular genre, but maybe it'll give you an idea, or maybe it'll inform you or shape you in a way that you're not even aware of.
And as a listener, you don't have to know the language. So like if you go to Italy and everyone's speaking Italian, you're lost because you don't know how to speak Italian. But if you go to a local cafe and there's some people playing Italian music, you can enjoy it just like the folks sitting next to you, because you're all speaking music together. It might be different music than you're used to hearing. So when you hear, African music with rhythms that are so sort of foreign to the Western ear, it might sound weird or whatever, but you can still enjoy it. And you can, and then if you're, let's say, musically inclined, maybe you're interested in how those rhythms work and what's, what's going on here? How did this evolve? Right. Because the story of America, and that, it's clearly just a combination of the British and Scottish Celtic music, the tunes. There's a big tune tradition in those cultures, which is played on fiddles and mandolins and sitterns and bagpipes and whistles and stuff like that. Definitely a little bit like old time American, what's referred to as old time American music, as opposed to bluegrass. So you had that, and you had then of course you had the influence of the music that the enslaved Africans brought with them to America, which is like a whole sense of syncopation and the drums and the rhythmic part of it, and then and the banjo, which is like an African instrument. So they had an awareness of strings, that kind of thing. They talk about South America only had flutes and percussion before the Spanish arrived in the 1500s, and then all of a sudden, South Americans had stringed instruments. They saw the Spanish guitars and they made their own crazy versions of stringed instruments. But anyway, and so you have the Celtic music and you have this African music. And of course, the enslaved Africans were handed European instruments like the violin. Okay. Now figure that out. And I mean, there's the influence of church harmonies for vocal music. So you put all that together and you kind of have what turned into American music. And, I think part of why music is that universal language is because it's the same 12 notes, more or less, in every language. It's the same. I mean, sure, there's different scales. There are microtones. There are variations, but basically it's the same 12 notes. People's ears hear the same major scale, a minor scale, this type of minor scale. And it all seems to make sense. And I remember even when I was in school taking, various music courses, to analyze classical music in a way that reduced it to a 1 chord, a 4 chord, and a 5 chord. Because even at the root, even when Bach was composing, and even when madrigal music was being made, and whatever was even older than that, there's something about the human brain and music and psyche that just embraces a 1 chord, a tonic, a root, and then moves to a fifth. And that seems not just logical, but pleasant and appealing. And then and on it goes. I played music for a while with an amazing fiddle player named Tex Logan, who was a great bluegrass fiddle player. And he was like 20 years older than me or so, 18 years older than me. And Texas, he was brought up in rural West Texas, and he was a great he was a great performer and a great fiery fiddle player, but he also loved jazz. And to him, like the diminished chord was so discordant and so like edgy that he just loved it. He loved the friction of that diminished chord, which is not as crazy as, 10, 20 years further along, when jazz musicians are playing with much, embracing many more sort of extensions of chords, flat 5 chords and sharp 11 chords and that kind of thing. Tex, he didn't like that. But he liked, so it's also partly like when you were born, I think, and what's in your ears. I see there's such a vast difference between like when I was a kid and trying to learn to play the guitar, the resources that I had and the way that I had to go about it is so different from like now. And frankly, if you go on, TikTok, you go on some social media, you can see young kids who are so absurdly talented, in terms of musicianship. They lack maturity, and their taste will evolve, this and that, but their dexterity and their ability on the instrument is so astounding. And I chalk it up to partly because it's what they hear and they see that, that's possible. So if that's possible, if he can do it, I could probably do that if I'll just figure out how to do it. I mean, before Eddie Van Halen sort of popularized this tapping thing on the guitar, and yes, you could go back in time. There were guys tapping on the acoustic guitar, but he sort of revolutionized that thing for rock music. And now you see kids like 9 years old that can, play the solo from Michael Jackson's Thriller. So it's hard to know where we're going. When I was a kid, when I was 12 years old, trying to learn how to play Black Mountain Rag by Doc Watson, I had a record and I had my little box record player, and it was like,
yeah.
You got to put the record back, find the right spot. You just want to hear that one, those 2 bars over and over. Now on the computer, you can get the amazing slower downer that slows the music down without changing the key. And you can see it on a video, and you can see how guys play, and they have a camera on their left hand, their right hand, their right arm, their posture, et cetera, et cetera. So the learning tools are much different.
Speaking of, learning tools, and obviously you were so influenced by the recordings that you were listening to, but you mentioned that you were in bands in Syracuse, New York, and Colorado. When you were working with all of these great musicians, how did they influence you? Because it's different when you're working with recordings. And I mean, as you said, the technology has advanced so much that, there's video now. You can actually see what people are doing. But even still, that's different than working like with people and collaborating with people. So what did you learn from some of these collaborations with your bandmates?
Well, all of that learning, that's just how you learn your instrument. That's one thing. Learning how to make music with other people, that's another thing. And learning how to be a good member of a band, that's partly musical and then partly social and that kind of thing. One great thing about playing with other people is sort of being influenced by others, by the influences of others, so other people that I played with is for sure introduced me to different musicians, different styles, different things. My friend Barry and I, we played in the New York Mandolin Orchestra for 20 years or so. Mandolin orchestras were a big thing, I think, certainly around the East Coast. And why? Because it was Italian and Jewish populations that wanted their kids to have music. And, but in those days, like, of course, that meant classical music. But who could afford a violin? That's crazy. So, hey, get a mandolin. That's cheap. And then you can play, because a mandolin is tuned like a violin, you could just pick up sheet music for a violin and play it.
Okay.
So you can play classical music. And the mandolin has a family, just like the violin. So you get the mandolin, and the mandola, and the mandocello, and a mando bass, which is just a bass. And so now you have all the strings, and all the voices, and you can play. You can play string quartets. You could play symphonic music, and that's what we did. And at some point, that led us to like being involved in a 2012 recreation of James Reese Europe's Clef Club Orchestra at Carnegie Hall. James Reese Europe, one of the first African American classical composers in America, who combined like the ideas of African syncopation into the classical, and sort of like jazz, what passed for jazz, right? Like ragtime kind of music into European classical music. And his orchestrations included a regular symphony orchestra with added 12 mandolins, 12 guitars, 12 banjos. So that's what I was doing at Carnegie Hall. I was one of the 12 mandolins.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it was very fun. And, but it also, as early as 1912, that's when his concert at Carnegie Hall was. Again, before lots of recorded music was available. And so I think, again, like somebody like that, just embracing the music that they hear, that they've been hearing in their ear, and trying to utilize it and move it forward, which I think is the same as today. I mean, even when you listen to rap and hip hop and current pop music, which is not 100% my cup of tea, but I have a 15-year-old, so I hear plenty of it, and you can hear somebody like an Ed Sheeran, who's obviously a super talented guy, but some of his earliest music really has Celtic influences in it. Now he just sounds to me like every other pop music thing. But so, yeah.
So when you came back to New Jersey and you started, was it Tony Trischka and the Skyline, correct?
Right. So I was in Colorado, and the bands that I was in out there had sort of run a lot of their course. And I got a call from my old friend, Tony, who said, come back. If you're moving back to the East Coast, we could put something together. So we moved back. Originally, it was myself and Tony and Barry. The first thing we did was started playing music, because you said I'm a guitar player and a singer and performer and a songwriter. I've also been a teacher. And so we hooked up with an agency in Bergen County, New Jersey, and created a show kind of like This Is Bluegrass Music, where like, this is the banjo, this is how the these are the instruments, this is a bit of the history of the music, this is how the vocals work. We would, if the school had violin players, we'd teach the kids some quick, easy thing. We'd teach the kids like a quick little square dance to do, et cetera, that kind of thing. So just a nice assembly program. We ended up playing at every single public school in Bergen County twice, which is a lot of schools. We would do 2 shows a day, 5 days a week. for months. Anyway, so I came back to the East Coast and we started doing that. But the lovely part of that for working musicians was that it was a school thing. So you were done by 3 p.m. And so we were together. We were playing a lot together. We're playing the same show over and over and over again. But then we started just making our own music. And we found a bass player. We found a woman. Dee Dee Weiland was involved in the group when we first put it together. And we started playing music around on the folk music trail, bluegrass music festivals, folk festivals, clubs, et cetera, et cetera.
You recorded albums as well. And then eventually you were touring Europe and Japan and introducing them to bluegrass music. So that must have been interesting as somebody who, as a teenager, was listening and was getting inspired from music all around the world. Now you had the ability to bring that music to Europe and Japan. What was that like? And what was the reaction to bluegrass music there?
Well, it was super exciting. We certainly, even then, but especially in hindsight, we consider ourselves super fortunate to have had all these, great experiences. For sure, music has taken me a lot of places around the world, which is exciting. And we just had some booking agents. I'll say partly it's because my friend Tony is a pretty well-known banjo player, and in many ways a very groundbreaking banjo player in the evolution of players and how the banjo is played as an instrument and stuff. Obviously, we weren't the first. We were like in maybe the third wave of bluegrass. They call the first wave of guys were like Bill Monroe and Flatt and Scruggs, Jimmy Martin. You go on and on. Ralph Stanley. Those guys were like 30s, 40s, 50s. Mm-hmm. I mean, they still kept playing and stuff. Then there was a second generation of younger guys. You have the Osborne brothers and Jim and Jesse, and and then it got to us, and then so we ended up playing all over Western Europe many times: Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands. And one thing about Western Europe was many of those places, they love American country music. Mm-hmm. Not everybody, but a handful. And somehow bluegrass music, again, because of technology, right? You could listen to records, and I mean, now records were much more snappy than they used to be in the 20s and 30s. So much easier to get at and all that. So people around the world who found an interest for whatever reason in this, like when we went to Japan, we were assigned this young guy who was our guide and translator, who happened to be a banjo player, and Tony happened to be one of his favorite banjo players, So for him, it was like a dream come true to hang out with his idol, and we just had so many fantastic experiences, playing bluegrass all around there. We got to go to Western Europe quite often. We went to Japan a couple of times. Maybe one of my favorite things was we got to go to Czechoslovakia in 1988.
When it was still Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, right before the fall of the Iron Curtain. Mm-hmm. And that was an extraordinary experience. It seemed so foreign. We were driving places and Russian convoys were crossing the road ahead of us. And we were taken to this giant folk festival called the Porta Festival in a town called Plzeň. We were driven in. We played an afternoon, so they drove us to a stage. We played a set on this stage to probably like about 10,000 people. We had played at festivals all over the United States and Canada. Canada has an amazing series of folk festivals in each province, very government supported, and so that at places like that, you're playing to like 10, 15, 20,000 people. We realized that was the small stage. They took us over to the main stage for the evening show. We played to about 40, 30 or 40,000 people.
Oh my gosh.
And who are these people who were gathered in the woods really for a folk festival? Some of it was described to us as people who were into tramping, which is like hiking, kind of tramping around, and you're camping out, so we got on stage, and they have a Czech person who's translating for us as we're, speaking to the crowd. And then they brought us back for an encore, and the MC said, okay, wait, come to the front of the stage. We come to the front of the stage, and the whole crowd was like, every person was holding up a candle, and he, for whatever reason, had sort of divided the giant crowd in thirds and had each third sing a note of a major scale.
Yeah.
A root, a third, and a fifth. And he's sort of, conducting the volume of the chord. And then when they brought the chord down and everybody blew out their candle.
Oh.
That was pretty magical. That was a great moment. So we've just had fantastic experiences. I've been had a great opportunity after Skyline to tour in Russia a couple of times. We went back to the Czech Republic post, after the so-called fall of communism. In Russia, this was not with Skyline, but with the dance troupe that I was playing with. We found ourselves all the way so far to the west that we were in Eastern. We were like in Siberia.
Wow.
In Asia, so far east that we've across the Ural Mountains in Asia, really up in the middle of nowhere, where they were sort of pointing off into the wilderness and saying, up there, that's where they would disappear people back in, back in the day. And so, that was all of that is just so fascinating to have had the opportunity to be in all these places, and to get a little bit of sort of preferential treatment because of why we were there. Yeah, it was just fantastic.
Bringing musical history at a time when the history itself was changing.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And to see how people around the world, we became very friendly with, like people who were into bluegrass and had bluegrass bands in Italy and, all over England. So it was interesting to see again how cultures were like this great Italian bluegrass band called Red Wine. Some of their original instrumental stuff definitely had sort of Italian folk flavorings to it. Mm-hmm. Just like when Tony would write a banjo tune, or when I would try to write a guitar instrumental, it might have might have some Jewish scales in it, some jazz in it, some this in it. So yeah, it was interesting to be exposed to all these people around the world. Now, also back in the day, like playing at the early bluegrass festivals when there was cultural tension between the older guys who were playing bluegrass and the folks who were in the audience who listened to that, and then the young upstart hippies who were coming in and trying to play that crazy bluegrass, playing a rock song, bluegrass style. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing. It's been interesting to see the evolution of that music up until kind of what it is today. You initially approached me about Americana music, which in my mind, like nowadays, when you say Americana, it really is, the first thing that comes to my mind is a narrow genre of music that's basically identified as for commercial purposes, mm-hmm. Because it is music that didn't really fit comfortably into other slots. It wasn't country, it wasn't rock, it wasn't folk music. Mm-hmm. It was it referred to like singer-songwriters. It was a little country, it was a little rock, it was a little whatever.
And there are people that don't like the term Americana just because of that. It's like, Well, it's just a catch-all phrase for music that's hard to define, or music that, we're having a hard time packaging. So we're just going to put it under Americana. And I can understand the frustration with the catch-all aspect of the term. Someone else had brought that up to me as well. So I've heard that before. But the other thing is that sometimes, even if it's not the best way to describe the music, if it gets people out there and listening to it, and then they can get curious and then they can research it, because people might not know a jug band, or they might not know every bluegrass or folk or what that really is. But Americana, people kind of have a general idea of that.
Well,
will get them interested in it.
but I think when you're saying Americana, to me, that's more like American folk, American folk traditions, because Americana sticks in my head like a marketing word.
Yeah.
I mean, go back to early records. They were only making records because they could sell them. I mean, so you could make recordings of people singing opera, or orchestras or whatever. But when you started recording country music, that was one thing. And then you started recording Black people playing basically blues. And that's the other thing, like blues. So again, back to that 1-4-5 musical progression. It's just like the blues that is essentially a creation, let's say, of African Americans with European instruments. It's a certain, whatever influence is sort of fed together, but that's at the root of every other kind of American music. It's at the root of country music and the root of jazz and the root of rock and roll. I mean, that's all. So, but all of those terminologies really are just marketing tools. Because back in the day, you just had music. But then when you had records, well, I mean, let's face it, white people aren't going to buy records by Black people. So we'll call these will be hillbilly records, and these will be race records. And there, we've defined the music and we've defined our audience.
Instead of just letting music be music, but again, it was unfortunately a different time. And,
but move a little further forward, and now you don't just have country music, but you have classic country, you got outlaw country, you got country rock, you got country this and country that, and it's all just further slices of, marketing tools. And I think Americana, what we're sort of referring to as Americana, folks who just went, look, I just wrote this song and I'm just playing you this song. And it's like a mix, it's more of a mix. And it was it wasn't this and it wasn't that and it wasn't this. So it took me a while to kind of think that really what you're talking about are the influences of these American traditions, on all these musics that have evolved.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, like there's no coincidence that this podcast is entitled Create Outside the Box, because, you were talking in the specific terms of marketing, but we as human beings like to understand things. So we're very quick to want to put things in boxes so that we can categorize and understand what it is. It's natural, but it's also limiting because we're defining it too quickly and we're not allowing it to just be. But again, sometimes there isn't a better, until we come up with a better vocabulary that speaks to a general audience, because if you are in the music, you understand the facets, you understand the details. But if you're trying to get people interested in something, sometimes you need a phrase that isn't so perfect to, again, get them to come in, get them to sit down, get them to be curious.
And like you said, I think the genre slices can be very limiting and like capturing. I mean, I've had endless conversations with people who love jazz, but hate bluegrass. They love this kind of music, but that kind of music, I like this, but I could never listen to opera. I mean, that seems whatever. And I always found that, interesting because I'm a person who I am open to everything. I want to hear different world music. I want to hear different countries' musical traditions, but I also want to hear the latest hip hop music, and I want to hear rap, and I like to listen to atmospheric, background music, and I love classical, so, and I know there are people like me, and I think that's, although maybe they're more in the minority.
Well, maybe we just aren't having these open conversations. Maybe this is a good point to delve into it, because we've been talking about throughout your musical journey how all of these different genres, whether it was the British invasion and their take on pop music and rock music at that time, or jazz, or African influences in the music that you listened to, how that shaped you as a musician. But now we're thinking, okay, we're talking more about the subject of Americana and what those influences are. And we're bringing up classical music, and we're bringing up that people are like, well, I like this, but I don't like that. But there was something about this folk music, and folk comes from the German word folk, which is people. Mm-hmm. It's literally just people music that really permeated and influenced so many different genres. And probably the furthest in someone's mind of what folk music could influence is classical music and opera. But in fact, it did. And we haven't really delved into it in a specific way, but we were talking about, folk music coming, earlier when people were immigrating to the United States, or they came over as slaves, and how their music created the sound of America. But there was also, from the 1940s to the 1960s, a great folk revival. And while some people might immediately go to artists like Bob Dylan or Woody Guthrie, this music also influenced composers like Aaron Copland and George Gershwin. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit, in your opinion, of how this music influenced classical music in that way.
So got to go back to the technology for a second, because where did Aaron Copland hear any of this folk? How on earth would a person like Aaron Copland come in contact with fiddle music, with folk songs, only through technology somehow, only through somebody like Harry Smith's recordings of the Anthology of American Folk Music in the early 50s, or really Alan Lomax was probably one of the most influential collectors of music, right, around the country, worked for the Smithsonian. You can see the Lomax archives are online. It's amazing. All of the field recordings, all of the videos that were taken. It's really astounding if you look up Alan Lomax archives.
Wow.
And there were some famous recordings that Alan Lomax put together. These are recordings that influenced songwriters like Bob Dylan and other folky kind of people. And so pretty sure that somebody like George Gershwin, who was just totally enmeshed in sort of the Tin Pan Alley approach to music, which was a very commercialized form. You're writing music for a specific commercial purpose, but then all this music that is referred to as the Great American Songbook, all these amazing sort of jazz swing era kind of pop tunes. They're so brilliant. They're so brilliant musically. They're so witty lyrically. They're just like perfect little gems. The same reason why rock music and pop music, why are songs like 2.5, 3 minutes long? It has less to do with people's attention span and more to do with the limits of the technology. That's how much space you could fit on a record. So, okay, great. I'll write songs that are that long. And now here we go. Yeah. So I think when somebody like Copeland hears like fiddle tunes, American, British fiddle tunes. There's something, like we've been saying, sort of appealing at a very base level.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, it's folk music. It's music. It's not music that was written. It really wasn't written for any other purpose than it wasn't written for a commercial purpose. It wasn't created for. It was created for like social purposes, communication purposes. To express love and death, and all the essential sort of simplistic or all the basic human emotions, right?
Exactly. Because, when we didn't really get into this part of the history, but you were saying a lot of the music, it was, for entertainment. It was like what you would perform on the back porch, or with your family members. It was accessible. It was also what you would sing in church, or it was inspired by those hymns and faith. Again, something that brought community together. But a lot of these songs were also work songs. And for the Americana Concert Series, we are linking it to the workers and the Industrial Revolution through the work of artist Marianne McKay, because she has her Silent Voices series, and also some of the local history here in New Jersey, because these were songs that the workers would either sing to pass the time, but they also became anthems for the union, anthems for we want a better life. A lot of the music described the hard times that these people were facing. And I just wanted to delve a little bit into that.
Well, I mean, life is hard. And if life is hard now, it was way harder 100 years ago and 200 years ago, And so when you go back, the music was for fun, for pleasure, but it also, then you had the music was for news, and to spread the news. Balladeers going from town to town. You had these child ballads that typically describe English child ballads that described all sorts of usually grim situations dealing with death and sadness and dying children and murder and just all the human condition. And so I think when you got up to like you say, with the rise to the unions, you could probably trace it back to work songs, slaves singing work songs out in the fields just to alleviate the misery and pass the time and whatever, because there's something elemental that appeals to people. So then you get up to, like you said, in between the two world wars, when the unions to Industrial Revolution was happening, and the workers, at a certain point, people are like, "Hey, we're getting screwed here."
Yeah,
so many different ways, and then the unions became a thing, and so how to focus people. It became clear that people will respond to these songs, and if you have a room full of 50 or 500 people, all these people singing these songs together seems to create unity. It happened during the era of the unionizing. It happened again clearly during the civil rights movement. Something like "We Shall Overcome" or "Amazing Grace," or these songs, again, because they just really have the power to galvanize people.
Because they're simplistic songs in a lot of ways, but boy, do they pack a punch, because they get to the core of the human emotion or the human condition. And it's something that people can immediately connect to. And so I'm wondering, is it like a chicken or egg situation when you had Now Gershwin, we were talking about, he was a little ahead of the movement because he passed away in the 30s. Porgy and Bess was 1935. So that was kind of before that official time period of 40s to the 60s, which was the great American folk revival. But if you look at that period of time, you're thinking World War II, you're thinking, all of the civil rights, human rights issues that were being brought up. Was that in a way making people go back to this folk music that spoke of those times? Or did this social movement happen and then they went, wait a second, we've got music that can really, speak to what we're going through?
Yeah, it's a good it's a good quandary. It's like you say, that because certain simplistic kinds of music hit a really basic human chord somehow. So what appealed to Aaron Copland about, it's a gift to be simple, just an old Shaker hymn, there was nothing, and not nothing, but, it's just very, very simplistic. The words are pretty simple and direct, and the melody is not much, but somehow in his hands became,
in the orchestral setting. Yeah. In the orchestral setting. Yeah. That he did. Its simple gifts took on
like greater meaning somehow. And it was as compelling to this wider audience that listened to that classical music as, just as it was to the 30 people sitting in a little wooden church in the middle of Pennsylvania or whatever, wherever.
Yeah, and with his opera, so his opera, The Tenderland, is a simplistic American story of, you've got these drifters or grifters who are coming into town, and you've got a young girl who's just finished school and has just been for generations on the family farm doing what, again, these were not people with a lot of money, and there were a lot of expectations, especially if you had an education. And what does life hold for me? And these were themes that were, again, going on when the original folk music was composed. Like, what does life hold for me? Where am I going? What is life? But also very much during this folk song revival, these were also themes of like, acceptance, so maybe in this opera you have grifters, but these people are different. Do we accept them? How is that any different than any social movement where there is a community that is looked out upon as outsiders, maybe because we don't know them, they don't look like us, they have a different faith, they have a different background, we don't want anything to do with them. So in this simplistic American story, just like these songs, they were really delving into deeper topics that maybe some audience members didn't even recognize. With Carlisle Floyd's opera, Susanna, which is basically like a big Appalachian story, set to a grander operatic way, but there are these simplistic folk elements that the composer puts into this operatic masterpiece. And when I was reading up on it, it is kind of surmised that he was talking about the McCarthy era, ever so slightly. In, again, this story of, someone being a little bit different and being ostracized by the community. So again, whether it's in the songs or in the arias, there are themes that we can, and larger themes that we can explore.
And then each generation, I mean, that wasn't unique to, some young adult in 1922. That's like just 2023, there's the same, like, who am I? What am I doing? Where am I going? How do I fit in? And the music is definitely becomes part of people's identity. I think the way that the basic folk songs were, influenced composers and songwriters, and it also influenced like people of my generation. It was like, oh, it's okay. I could write a song. I could express my own self through music. You didn't have to be, like that. Nope, this is only for well-trained professionals.
Yeah.
Like everybody could do it. And that now it's an explosion of that, because recording, the way that you can record music now is so different than it was 20 something years ago and back. That just everybody can do it, and everybody does do it. I think even now, and there's so much has been exposed now in terms of like who the musicians are, what all the influences are, how they interact with each other. We're in an era, where histories that have long been denied are being exposed, the racial things and political things. The music stays like a constant thread that maybe it lets people hold on to a little bit, these old folk melodies, the way that somebody like Woody Guthrie, who clearly, super influential person, he didn't really write a lot of melody. To him, the better to come up with an old melody, because that's already like in people's heads. But then, that's familiar. But now I'm going to put some new words on it and make it about a union thing, or a lynching thing, or
It's true though, because the thread is a really good analogy, because this all shapes the tapestry. This all creates the tapestry of what is America. And all of these different colors and textures and historical points, not all of them are pretty, but it does come together to create a shared experience of what this country's history has been.
Yeah.
And you can't have light without dark, and you can't hide maybe the parts of the tapestry that aren't as beautiful. You have to see it in its whole to understand what it is and how to use it and how to move forward.
Yeah.
And I think that the interesting thing about this music, and you're talking about how it was something like songwriting, like this is something that's more accessible. This is something that I can perform. This is something that I can do. You don't have to be the trained professional to do it. Is it gave people who felt like they didn't have a voice, a literal voice.
Yeah. And maybe my 2 cents is worthwhile, it's meaningful to me, but maybe somebody, and I think that's why a lot of early, all these ballads and, Woody Guthrie wrote a lot of silly songs, children's songs, stuff like that. But he also wrote some really grim songs, about current events, migrants going down in a plane crash, or union workers being burned up by the union bosses in a that kind of a situation, in the copper mines somewhere up in the northern United States, and so many of the like a fantastic movie is Matewan, John Sayles' Matewan, which is about like the organizing in Kentucky coal miners. There's a lot of folk music in the movie. And, a lot of that music is it's sad, it's dark, it's about death and unhappiness and misery. And that was a condition of many people's lives. Life was difficult and hard. And somehow, bluegrass music is kind of, it's like famous for the notion that it's peppy music, but can be dark lyrics. It's about, even if it's not death, but it's just lost love, or, being jilted by your lover. And then, of course, you just have your run-of-the-mill murder ballads and all that kind of stuff. Somehow, maybe the music, you know, was a bit of a buffer to that sadness.
I was going to say, it took something that was hard and heavy, and it condensed it into its most basic point of something that could be then digestible, you know, something that you could then process. Sometimes the things that we deal with in life, and again, we've been talking about a lot of heavy topics that this music comes out of, whether it's, you know, unions or civil rights or racism, or just being poor and struggling to put food on the table for your family. That was a lot of what this music was about, but they were able to condense it down to a basic point that people could digest and make peace with. And going back to Woody Guthrie, you know, you have, you know, something like "This Land Is Your Land, This Land Is My Land," which, you know, kids might know the song in school and it's happy, but again, it was deeper than that. It was a response to Irving Berlin's "God Bless America." And, you know, Irving Berlin had his perspective and he was grateful and a very patriotic, you know, American, but, you know, Woody had a different perspective and was of a different generation and was like, is this land the land of you and me?
He was quite clear in his final verses that, you know, that I can't remember the verse off the top of my head, but, you know, I was wandering down the road and I saw a sign there that said private property. And like, on this side, this land is not for you, you know. Yeah. Now, it's very, and I wonder, though, having said all of that about technology and all of that, whether, you know, at some elemental emotional level, if you're a pioneer family, you're all by yourself, you're out on the plains of Kansas and, you know, in 1821, and sheer luck, you know, one of you knows how to play the guitar or the fiddle or something. That's it. That's all you had for like entertainment or distraction.
Or a way to express yourself.
Yeah.
Especially as human beings, we feel the need to express ourselves other than just talking to people. We need to.
And I'm not sure it's any different or tremendously different now with all the technology. I mean, with the, you know, with 2023 crazy tech, it's the music still really hits an emotional, you know, has an emotional punch. And I see it you know, often when I perform. I've performed so many gigs playing music for other people in situations where they're intently listening, absorbing every moment. You can hear a pin drop, or where you're just background music on a subway platform or at a restaurant or whatever it is, you know, or you're playing so people can dance to the music. Even in the situations I find where, you know, your basic function is like background music, people listen, people respond. Children, you know, I mean, I played a gig just yesterday, freezing cold outdoor fall festival up at some pretty well-to-do country club in upstate New York, or, you know, like in Sleepy Hollow, New York. And, you know, I mean, it's a lot of well-off folks having a fall festival, you know, which means, you know, painting pumpkins and barbecue and what all. And there were loads of families, lots of little kids, and every little child that walks past the band starts, you know, bouncing along to the music, and some of them more than others, but, you know, some of them get right. Really, there's just something about it that really you know, you can see it grabbing the kids, like as they start walking by, and all of a sudden they're like, and they don't know this music. They just hear like a beat and a groove and catch the sort of emotional delivery that we're having a good time playing this music. And yeah, like immediately there's that human connection. It's easy to make, way easier to make that human connection. I have a good friend who runs has been running for probably 30 years or something called Common Ground on the Hill down in Maryland. And it's evolved over time, but it's basically was to find common ground through music. So each summer they'd have, it's a like kind of adult camp kind of thing too, where people go and they learn how to play instruments and write songs and do this, that. But there's always a component of it that were like two disparate political or social or ethnic groups coming together, trying to find that common ground, so Israelis and Palestinians, or Native Americans and cowboy music, that kind of thing. And it was always a way to find that common ground.
Do you think that's the legacy of this music, is that it is a music, again, folk of the people, that the legacy of the music is that it's a way for people to connect and a way for people to find that common language, and that's why it endures and that's why it's so popular?
I'd say yes, that's exactly it, because there's so many different genres, people that love this and don't like that. But, there's some people that you could play a simple Irish dance tune for that wouldn't like it. But it does, like you said, even today with so many different things and so many different things competing for your attention every minute, every screen, different kinds of music, different kinds of film. Now you got short films, long, different attention span. There's still something that draws people back to music is one of those things. I think it's because of what you said. It's so simple and elemental, and sort of anyone can do it. Like not anyone can do it, but anyone could do it, if you.
It's relatable, it's accessible. And like with the kids bopping and dancing, it speaks to something primal in us, that wants
different than, like, I don't think not everybody could be a writer or a poet. Not everybody can. And you can't really be a filmmaker unless you have certain amount of technology. My wife says filmmaking is nothing more than storytelling, telling human stories, but you got to have a camera and a projector and a this and a that. Friends who are actors are like, well, no one's going to pay me $50 to go out to a bar tonight and act, and furthermore, I have to get like a whole structure around, in order for me to do my little art, my little acting, I need other people to buy into it and act with me.
Yeah.
And I need a person to write the play for me, so I know what words to say. And then I need a director to tell me where to stand and how to do, classical musicians too. A lot of classical musicians really don't have the knack of improvisation, which I think has been lost over centuries, when classical musicians were sort of the only kind of musicians. So these classical musicians who are extraordinarily gifted and, adept on their instruments. But if you say, good, let's jam on some blues in C, they don't really know what to do.
No, I wouldn't know what to do. It's just a different, I could play around, I could figure it out. It's just a different approach.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I think it's wonderful when we can learn from each other. And I do agree that some of it's been lost, because granted, I think the big difference is that classical music, opera, all of the genres in between, they're just more structured. And so there would be at one time, at the height of opera, you would have these giant sections where the soloists would have cadenzas and they would compete over like the most elaborate cadenza. And what's a cadenza? It's just improvisation, ornamentation, right? Yeah. But because it's such a structured art form, now we've taken the best of the best. And it's like, well, you can only do this here, and this is not stylistically appropriate here. And there's a lot more rules and regulations.
But that speaks to like the human need to compartmentalize too, like bluegrass music, which was sort of formalized in the 40s, 50s, people hear it and they think, oh, it's old timey music, but no, it's music that was really formalized really after World War II, a little bit, but it came from like this old, you'd say now is old time music, where like everybody's just kind of playing together and they're kind of playing the melody. And then bluegrass music was like the really sort of the influence of, again, of big band music, and jazz was a music that pushed an individual forward to take a solo while the rest of the band kind of stepped back to support. If it was an all instrumental song, that's how it worked. And just like jazz, the first go around, you state the melody, some instrument does, and then everybody gets a turn to improvise. And then at the end, you state the melody. And that's just like jazz, just like a jazz tune, just like
And it's similar to some classical music. Again,
Yeah, it's.
There are variations. Again, I would say classical is probably the most structured, and maybe bluegrass or jazz to a certain extent has more freedom. But we're all kind of based off of the same original pattern. It's the same language, just maybe different vocabulary. And
that's why it's so wonderful when you see a recording like Stefan Grappelli with Yehudi Menuhin, and how they, like, two amazing, technically gifted violinists, but so different, and how their worlds kind of collide and connect.
And coming back to this greater theme that you brought up, in that look at these different worlds, but they can connect and they can learn from each other. And what's the greater message that we as human beings can connect and learn from each other, even if we're coming from very different backgrounds or a different way of doing things or perceiving things.
And I know somebody like James Reese Europe, one of his goals was the betterment of his people, right? It was a similar era to like W.E.B. Du Bois, and that like the beginnings of sort of thoughts of equality and all this. So he was hoping to accomplish some of that through music. And I think it's the same thing today. Why people still respond. I mean, why does a restaurant still have some guy in the corner playing covers of folk song? Yeah, just everywhere you go, music is an integral part of everything. That it's a very interesting part of the human experience. Like watch a film and turn off the soundtrack. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't work as well. And you can still be in a room full of people, and I think it would be much more difficult to mesmerize a crowd with a poem or a story. You can do that too. But, one great musician or one, kind of emotive musician can really captivate a large crowd of people in ways that are tough to do otherwise,
Definitely.
I mean, at Woodstock, you can have the Who come out and Jimi Hendrix, and he can burn his guitar, but then you can have Richie Havens come out and sit on a stool with one guitar and command the crowd just the same, No,
it's true. It at the end of the day, it comes back to the people and the basic use of music to express something greater than yourself, and that you share that. Again, it's storytelling, something that all of the arts are linked with, their way of storytelling, but it's a way to storytell and share the human experience. And I think that that's why the arts endure. And I think that's why this Americana music or folk music has endured and will endure for years to come.
I agree. It's pre-language, So I'm sure there were people beating on logs and singing little melodies without words or whatever before there was really certainly written language and maybe even spoken language, exactly, as ways to communicate all kinds of different emotions, right?
Exactly. Now, if people want to learn more about you or to find out where you're performing next, say they want to go to the next fall festival and hear you perform, where would they get information?
Yeah, you can look on my website, which is danny@dannyweiss.com. As an early adapter of the interweb, I was able to get my own domain name. And I'm also on Facebook. haven't been doing as good a job about maintaining my calendar online, but I'll try to do better. I also have a day job I've been working as a librarian for many years. So I can't give music quite as much time as I often would like to.
Well, before we let you go, let's end on that, because again, you are an educator and you do work at the library. How does that complement your music career?
I played music full time until I was about 40, and then I came back to school. So for any of you out there that are thinking you've missed your opportunity, no, you can come back. And I started working as a librarian in my early 40s. And at first I was very much like, okay, well, I guess I was a musician and I guess now I'm a librarian. But no, of course, the two things obviously work together.
And you do.
And I think that for me personally, my experiences as a performer, my general comfort level of, in terms of being in front of people, that kind of thing, definitely helped out in terms of, interacting with people, and allowed me to, a lot of times librarian, in some ways, what you're doing is helping connect people to what it is they're looking for or looking to do. Information, guidance. Sometimes it's comfort. The library is a public space where people come in, and sometimes they just need a little attention and a little
support,
comfort. And I feel like that's a little bit sometimes music is a little like that too.
I was going to say, it's got a similar mission of, making people feel at home, making people feel seen, explore different worlds, so I see the connection.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you very much for taking
it's been my pleasure
to speak with me. And it's been a very interesting conversation. Again, all of Danny's information will be in the show notes if you want to learn more about him and his upcoming shows. Thank you so much.
All right, Corinne, I'll talk to you soon.
All right, talk to you soon. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Create Outside the Box. Please subscribe, rate, and share our podcast. You can listen to Create Outside the Box on Spotify, Buzzsprout, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. Check us out on our Creative Operations YouTube channel, where you can subscribe to watch our interviews. You can find and follow Creative Operations on our Facebook page and on Instagram at @CO_Creative Operations. For more information about Creative Operations, please visit www.creative-operations.org.